Good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to today's event on wildness, lost landscapes, and belonging with the innovative landscape architect, Florence Stimson. I'm Jamie Boyer, the Vice President for Education here at the New York Botanical Garden, and this is the final lecture in our Landscape Design Portfolio series this year. And thanks to the sponsorship, Monica Heinbold, we could not run these without your generous support. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the New York Botanical Garden is located in the ancestral homeland of the Lenape Delaware people. We honor them and acknowledge their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. In addition to today's program, the New York Botanical Garden offers many classes, workshops, and public lectures in landscape design, horticulture, gardening, and many, many more. We just added many winter classes to our website, including photography and craft workshops inspired by our holiday train show. For those of you in the New York area, be sure to check out 2 upcoming book talks in our Mertz Library Reading Room, Black Flora with Terry Spate on February 27th, and Botany and Betrayal with Patrick Spiro on March 12th. Now, it is my privilege to introduce Susan Cohen, the coordinator of our Landscape Design Certificate Program and our Landscape Design Portfolio series. Since 1988, Susan has been instrumental in guiding future generations of landscape designers. Thank you, Susan, for all that you do for the garden, our students, and the larger community. It's all yours, Susan.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a delight to introduce the final speaker in this year's portfolio series, landscape architect Florence Stimson. Before receiving her master's degrees in landscape architecture and regional planning, Lauren graduated from Bates College, where she studied theater and geology. She is a founding partner with her husband, Stephen, of the firm Stimson, which has an office in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as well as a rural studio in Princeton, Massachusetts, called Charbrook, which is also a working farm and a plant nursery. The firm has its roots, so to speak, in this land, as Charbrook is close to the working dairy farm that has been in the Stimson family for 10 generations. And Lauren's family has roots in the area as well. I think she said she lived 2 towns away. Through personal history then, as well as inclination, Lauren's design ideas have been shaped by rural life, agrarian landscapes, and related interests in art, craft, foraging, and gardening. Much of her work explores forgotten histories, wildness by intent, and spontaneity. A sense of community is very important to this firm, as is longevity, sustainability, and slowness. They still, for example, draw by hand. They believe that the process is just as important as the end project. In recognition of their design excellence, Stimson received the coveted Firm Award from the American Society of Landscape Architects in 2021. And last year, Lauren received the great honor of a Rome Prize Fellowship from the American Academy in Rome. She will present projects in Old Lyme, Connecticut, Northeast Harbor, Maine, San Antonio, Texas, and her home ground of Charbrook. Also, as time allows, she'll talk about her time in Rome. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you so much, Jamie and Susan and LaToya, Nadine, everybody who has walked me through this. I am really excited to be here. I'm very honored and humbled. So tonight, I'm going to start my timer. I have a lot to go through that I'm excited to share. I would like to start with what I'm calling foundations and just some thoughts about our practice to introduce you to the firm if you're not familiar with our firm. Then I'm going to focus on 3 projects and then our farm, Charbrook, which is a project, and then my time in Rome. So we are a firm of just over 40 now, and this was our retreat a couple of weeks ago here on the farm. We like to have a lot of fun. We have an urban studio in Cambridge and this rural, location in Princeton, Mass, Central Mass, near the base of Mount Wachusett. And I think what I've been most interested in since I've returned from Rome is thinking broadly about our practice and the kind of work that, you know, we were known for early on. Actually, it was Steve who founded the firm in 1992, and I became a partner years after, but we are partners. Early work, I think a lot of people are familiar with. We have a book, 10 Landscapes. And eventually the work has started to evolve. I think in the last, 10 or 15 years, the work has almost become, as somebody in our retreat spoke about the other day, this is one of my favorite things about the studio, is that the work is almost unrecognizable. You don't necessarily know that it's us, that it's the work of Stimson, because it's so varied. And I would attribute that to 5 principals who have very different upbringings, different genders, different, walks of life, and grew up in different parts of the country. And just leadership and design leadership and innovation and thought throughout the firm at every level that contributes to the projects. And I really like that. I like that as I get older in this profession, I love that the firm, this studio, has a real attention to individual thinking. And I'll get into that more with myself. And I think tonight, Susan asked me to speak, and I'm going to speak about my design philosophy, where I think it came from, why I think the way I do as a landscape architect. And I can't not start with my parents. And I didn't ever talk about this before BLM several years ago. And it gave me the confidence, I think, to sort of say, you know what, my mom is from the Philippines. She was an immigrant. My father was in the Peace Corps in the 60s. This is my sister. 1969, them stepping on the plane at the tarmac of Manila Airport, getting on the plane to go back to the United States. So I was born in 77. My sister was born in 69. My parents came back to the United States 2 years after the Supreme Court legalized interracial marriage amongst all states. So that was the climate for a biracial family moving to rural Massachusetts in the middle of nowhere. I grew up very rural, across from a dairy farm, 2 towns over from where I live, where I'm sitting right now. I played in the woods a lot. I played in the pasture behind the house. And that really informed my thinking at an early age that I was safe outdoors. And I was, like many biracial children, I think, in the 70s and 80s, I was encouraged to embrace my ethnicity in a comfortable, safe location. So for instance, on Sundays, I would go to Filipino school. During the week, I would go to my, rural school that was primarily white. So I think how this informed my design thinking is that I started to think about myself from 2 different lenses, and even 3 different lenses: my father's world, my mother's world, my own mixed world. And I never had one narrative. There was never one modern grand narrative of my life and my perspective. And I've always been interested in multiple stories, multiple lenses, different ways of people seeing the same thing, different people seeing the same thing. I traveled a lot. I was lucky. My parents brought me to the Philippines at a young age. In college, I drove across the country, probably much to my parents' dismay, twice with boyfriends. I got to see a lot of landscape. I worked on a dude ranch in college for 2 summers, loved it. Loved geology, really love mineral hunting. My grandfather had taken me spelunking, and, I was sort of a nerd when it came to all things outdoors, when it came to, wilder landscapes. I was a theater major at Bates College, as Susan said, really interested in classical Greek drama. I studied geology also. I had a minor in geology. I ended up working for the U.S. Geological Survey after graduation. So I think my interest in directing, set design, costume design, and earth science eventually led me to landscape architecture. I had never heard of it until, I started thinking about graduate school. For about 10 minutes when I was living in Albuquerque, New Mexico after graduation, I thought maybe I'll study volcanology, but it was too much science for me, not enough art. So I went to the Happy Valley. I went to UMass Amherst. I loved it there. I loved every single minute of my graduate school experience. I can't really say that is the same for a lot of my colleagues in my firm. And I'm so lucky that I had the time that I had there. I was taught it was like the turn of the 1990s into the early 2000s, and I was taught by a handful of ecologists and a handful of modernists. And what that gave me was this total hybrid perspective of landscape architecture. We spent a ton of time outdoors doing field labs. And then we spent a lot of time looking at, modernist design, but also what I would call postmodernist landscape theory. So a lot of books about graphic designers, historians, ecologists, how they informed landscape architects and how they actually weren't over here. They were like working in tandem. All of a sudden there was, a design competition in Toronto and like Bruce Mau's working on it and, Rem Koolhaas is working. And it was a completely different way of thinking about landscape architecture. And I had some professors that were not into it at all. And they were like, no, the landscape architect needs to be focused on only the physical. And other landscape architects were like, no, ecology is really important. And, so is social framework and economics. So I loved the concept that, this stuff that you see in the physical is important. The stone walls, the soil, the topography, the views. But all the hidden stuff is equally as important and that can shape us. And I went to school at a time when that wasn't taken for granted. I mean, now that seems like a no-brainer and students come out of school thinking this. Well, it wasn't always the case. And I think I went to school at the shift, the cusp of this different, philosophy. And I love that. I like that I had that hybrid view. So how that shaped my early years, one of my first projects coming out of graduate school was this project called Northeast Harbor. So I was going back to Maine, which was exciting, which was where I got my first licensure, actually, and the state of Maine. I was so excited about this project because I had studied cultural landscapes and preservation with Ethan Carr at UMass Amherst. And this was the home of Charles Eliot, the senior, who was the president of Harvard University. He was a Rockefeller, cohort. He helped found Acadia National Park on this homestead, his homestead. It was called the Ancestral, this old home. That was his family home. And he had a son, Charles Eliot, the junior, who founded the Trustees of Reservations, was a landscape architect, prominent. Most of you probably have heard of him. Well, this was very exciting to me to fly up here and to see this project. I had heard that they took the house down. They hired Gwathmey Siegel, who was a prominent, obviously, New York architect. When we got to the site, it was very, very compromised. It was scary. They had blasted for construction for a walkout lower floor. The footprint for the site and the kind of development that was happening was out of scale with what I would call a fragile climax forest. You can see in the background here, I'll point out, very, very shallow soils, 6 to 15, 18 inches of soil, huge trees, red spruce growing on it. Very, very scary. And especially when you have a client who says, I am equally so disturbed by this, and I would like you to make it go away and make it like it never happened. And so we launched and embarked upon probably the most, highly intensive ecological restoration project that the firm had done to date. I immediately turned to my love of history, and I became fascinated by some historic photos of what Eliot's homestead and historic landscapes had been, because this was no longer there on site. This site was basically 100% climax forest. There was very little diversity. And so I became totally fascinated by some of these remnant landscapes, the high meadow, the alpine, lichen, birch groves. And so that became our restoration strategy, bringing back these lost landscapes to the site, not just for diversity, but this is what would, thrive on shallow soils. So we developed plant palettes. We had a scheme that obviously worked with the grain and the geology of the site. We had a main house, a carriage house, a lower boathouse. So different levels of occupation across the site, 80 feet of grade change, and hugely, involved relationship. This is my first time really developing in sync relationship with a contractor. I mean, we were completely hand in hand. I was up there every week during construction. We developed soil specs with John Swallow from Pine and Swallow. He became a fast friend, sourcing granitic sand, crab shells. And we came up with this like custom compost sands, loam blend. Everything was sourced locally. Everything was, these trees 30 feet tall. You can see the scale. Look at the men with the root balls. These trees were sourced from, sites that were slated for, demolition or development, and they would bring them back to the site. it was just an incredibly ambitious project. And it went from really large scale to really small scale and thinking about the next generation of spruce. And I became very hands-on in this early project and very excited about, touching plants, being there on site, working with a contractor. I'll never be the type of person who just shows up with a coffee cup, points, it's like, I've always got to be part of it. These are images of what it looked like within, 2 to 5 years after the restoration. This had been a culverted stream during the entire construction process. And here we have moss that, has grown back. Some of it we placed. All of this is recreated, completely recreated. And new types of ecologies, right? Like the stormwater garden, they blasted this lower area and ledge. All of a sudden we've got, visible stormwater and a whole new type of garden experience for the client at every scale. So that was sort of my first foray into lost ecologies, lost landscapes, a narrative, how to look to history and bring what was good from history forward. The next project, as most landscape architects do, you're working on multiple projects. I was working on this at the same time, thinking at a completely different scale. So this is San Antonio, Texas, 7th largest city in the United States. Started working on this project in 2007, won a design competition. We were working with Dirt Studio, Julie Bargman, David Hill, wonderful people there, lifelong friends. And this site was about 9 miles north of the city center, but in a very densely populated neighborhood. And the mayor of San Antonio wanted this to be a citywide park. And just to give you the scale, the jump, this is 311 acres. And the concept was this Mayor Phil Hardberger, had basically convinced the city through city bonds. They voted, the public voted on this, and they bought this parcel, 2 parcels, 2 separate occasions. The first parcel was 107 acres on the right, that was about 16 million, and the 204 acres on the left, that was 31 million. So that's a lot of money for the public to pony up, and they got behind it because the city knew they wanted a park. And the one sort of caveat I would say is it's 2 parcels separated by a highway, a 6-lane highway. And I'll come back to that at the end of this project. The scale is 1 mile across and it's a ½ mile, north to south. It's got a beautiful creek running on the east side. This is Mayor Phil Hardberger. He sort of charged us with, one of the things he loved about the park were the ancient oaks, the live oaks, very characteristic of this part of Texas and almost disappeared. They sort of were lost in the scrub and the overgrown mesquite and persimmon woods. This was an old dairy farm that had basically been abandoned, and it was really degraded landscape. So we quickly turned to a lot of site history, of course, and working across both teams with Dirt Studio, we became really captivated with this concept of the missions, the acequias, and the agrarian landscape in contrast with sort of the wilder landscape of the site, the live oaks and the persimmon. And this is what it all comes down to for me in landscape architecture. And every project has this, the line, the curve, the cultivated, the wild. And this is an image from a mission outside of San Antonio, very inspirational to us, this idea of carving a room out of the wild. So that's what we did. 311 acres, we basically said, you know what, this is going to be a different type of park. We're not going to program the heck out of it. We're going to save 75% of it and enhance and restore it. And then the other 25%, we're going to be really careful about how we put program back. So Urban Ecology Center, farm, farm worlds and learning center at the farm, a Salado Creek pavilion, playgrounds, picnic areas, trail systems, everything was just absolutely carved in. This is an urban ecology center that we ended up doing with Lake Flato, 10,000 square foot, really high performance building, LEED recognized. It's now sort of the home of the Park Conservancy there, where they actually have a bunch of lectures and public outreach and events. Landscape is completely integrated into the experience of the architecture. Early concept sketches for how to integrate, picnic and play and active recreation. There's minimal active recreation there into existing live oak and cedar elm woodland. Every material is, it was thought of as being distinctly local. So for instance, this is ash juniper that you're seeing on the staves that we harvested from, plants that we actually cut down during the clearing to create these outdoor rooms. They're reused as pavilions, shade structures, and as enclosure to keep the kids in the playgrounds. We've got stormwater, visible stormwater with these flow-through curbs using local limestone as rain gardens. Concept sketch for how to bring people closer to, for instance, the karst and limestone formations of the Salado Creek, which were not visible in any areas, and creating an overlook to really bring people closer to that geology and being bold with form and material. And we did everything. We did the signage. I mean, this was incredible. During this 12-year process that we worked with the city of San Antonio, they changed the name. It was originally Volker Park, and then it became Hardberger Park. That's how well loved this mayor has become there. And it was a real learning curve, to be able to say what is important about this place, and let's have a delicate touch and insert only what is needed to enjoy it, so that you don't destroy it. And that, I think, is what we really learned. I really learned from this project. 8 miles of trails winding through. And then we did this test plot, this 30-acre test plot of oak savanna. It was proposed less than 1% of native Texas prairie remains. And we wanted this to be a model for how that restoration could occur, especially in a managed landscape. And so I think this is maybe one thing to just touch upon. When you work in a site that's already something, like a wilder landscape or a developed landscape, I think it takes a lot of creative thought and pause and restraint to say what's important about this when you're walking through the woods. I mean, this was all woods when we were there. And that's what I loved about this design process was we said, you know what, these live oak trees are really important and we're going to do something here. And it takes that premonition and that ability to think, we save these trees, we insert these lines, this becomes the bikeway. We don't need any signage because the trees are going to be the slow down, everybody, get off your bike. And I think that's what's so wonderful about this kind of process, working with a landscape like this, where you have so many incredible features that you, as a designer, need to think carefully about how not to compromise them. The last piece of this project, which is very near and dear to us, is the land bridge. We conceived of this in 2008. That's many, many years ago. It took 12 years to get to the point of getting back into design. This is my husband's sketch, which I've always loved. He does these wonderful back of the napkin sketches. It was how to bridge across the 6-lane highway and bring animals and people. It's a different attitude about a land bridge that had never really been thought of before. We couldn't find many models. We found a lot of eco-duck models in Europe and up in Banff in Canada, and we found a lot of wildlife overpasses that were just for wildlife, but we never really found one like this that was for people and for wildlife. And so we worked with a ton of consultants. We worked with Arup, we worked with a lot of ecological consultants, Rialto Studio, our wonderful partner in crime down there, amazing landscape architects that know the Texas flora and fauna. And, we came up with this giant structure that is 150 feet wide and about 200 feet long and across. And there's a pedestrian zone and a wildlife zone. And we worked with the biologists to figure out, what are those thresholds and what are those dimensions. During construction, we got photos like this when the girders went up. This is from a contractor. This is during construction. You can see they're laying out the grid, the web of irrigation, just an incredible feat. We have these areas where we're collecting rainwater, so they recirculate, and with cisterns so that they actually use the passive water system for drought, which is a big deal in Texas. This is shortly after planting, like the following year. And I think maybe the things to point out that are interesting, we came up with this idea of a skywalk, which you can see here, which brings people in an accessible way. There's a huge amount of earth movement. I mean, 4 feet of soil across this thing for, well over 200 feet to extend back so that you can have a, less than 5% walk up this. And making this accessible was a huge feat of engineering. In grading. The grading plans alone were phenomenal. We have wildlife blinds at the top. We worked with local artists to create those. And the wildlife really have have the majority of space here. And then we've got these, protective fences that sort of herd them in. And it's working. It's working. It's working wonderfully. And we're seeing animals that have never really been seen before unless they were roadkill, which was horrific. And we want it to be a model. I mean, this is obviously a huge feat of, time and creative energy and resources. But this happened because of a city bond. They voted for this project, and the taxpayer dollars paid for a portion of it because the city of San Antonio wanted it to happen. This cost $23 million, and it was 12 years in the making. This is an image of the skywalk. We really wanted to get up through the canopy. And this is the top of the land bridge. You don't even realize that you're on a bridge. And this is the wildlife blind, and here are 2 white-tailed deer. It's working. So we're very excited about that. All right, on to another project that's near and dear to my heart that I've been working on for many years. This is the Florence Griswold Museum. It is a very small but mighty museum that some people may not have heard of, but it is the home of American Impressionism in the country. It sits on the edge of the Lieutenant River. It's almost 12 acres in size. Lieutenant River is right at the mouth of the Connecticut River. So this is a very special place where a woman named Florence Griswold had a boarding house. Her father left it to her, and she basically rented her house out to a lot of artists. And this happened at the turn of the 20th century. So 1900s, 1910s, even a little bit before that, a lot of these very famous Impressionist painters, Henry Ward Ranger, Childe Hassam, would come here and spend all times of the year living in the boarding house, but painting scenes of Old Lyme and the Connecticut River, area and estuaries around, wildness, cultivated agrarian landscapes, rural scenes, also village scenes. A very inspirational place for landscape painting. When I came to the site, the former director had wanted to think about a comprehensive plan for the project, because on the top row, you can see here, at the conception of this place, it basically was a total of almost 15 acres. And over time, like many Yankees too, she sold off parcels of her land, and it had became parcelized. And then in the late 30s, and 40s, they thought, we need to make a museum out of this. She was long gone. Basically, it was just the house that was left. So this director worked on putting the land back together. So he finally had put the landscape back together through a series of creative real estate purchases. And he said, I need help. What should we do with the land? Now we have land. Instead of the museum being all about paintings inside a building, what should we do? And so I became, again, fascinated by the history of the artists and their preoccupation with the landscape. So we did a lot of research into their archives. And I found this quote, which I will always go back to whenever I work here. And it's about how the edges are where it's at. and the edges are the places where the artists occupied. They would often sit at the edge of a landscape, here at the river's edge, in a hedgerow, in a wild ravine, and paint the scene from afar. And so we thought, okay, let's look at the edges. What are the edges of the property? Now let's put back together, what do we have? What are we dealing with? So we worked with an ecologist and realized we don't have a lot. We have a lot of invasive species. We don't have a lot of, native or indigenous plants that were represented in the original paintings. And that was very frustrating to us as landscape architects, because we're trying to tell a story and we realized it's all gone. It's hardly there. So we had a lot of work to do. And so we basically pitched this idea of, okay, this is an early sketch. Let's circulate around the edges. We know we want to bring the ravine back. We want to bring the hedgerow back. We want to get back to this waterfront, wild waterfront of, meadow all the way down to some kind of, emergent wetland. And so we wanted to connect those pieces, and eventually came up with this, what we called the artist trail. This was this comprehensive plan and this, sort of circumnavigating experience that went through a series of revived landscape experiences, like the yard, the orchard, the emergent wetland, an overlook, finally getting people to the river, the thicket in the meadow. So really, it was about diversity. The sort of layer on top of the art and the history and the land use history was It was all lawn. On the left-hand side in the top here, you can see it was basically mown lawn when we came on this project. And on the right hand, you can see we wanted to change that. And one of the reasons why was because we realized we're on the Atlantic flyover. There's this layer of ecology or environmental ethic that's missing at the museum. You know, this is the home of Roger Tory Peterson, who wrote all the Peterson guides. This is an incredibly active area for ecological thinking and sort of the birthplace of, you know, this is why DDT was banned, because Roger Tory Peterson noticed that, you know, the osprey were declining in the 70s. So there's this whole story and narrative of songbird decline, avian species moving through this site and other sites that this is connected to, and how the museum landscape could contribute to that by rewilding. And we got a grant. We wrote a grant that was focused on ornithology and ecological restoration for avian habitat. And we got a $1 million grant with the museum because of this plan and these types of graphics and images and proposals. It completely influenced the way we thought about our construction documents and our planting plans. This is one of my favorite construction document drawings of all time. It's beautiful because it's about a story. It's not just about bird boxes and, you know, heron boxes and, you know, heron stands. It's about how are we going to bring this habitat back to this site? And I'm a big believer in graphics, graphics and conveying a narrative even through construction documents. So these are some of the images that we produced during our design phase. And I'm just going to go through them. I don't need to say a lot. I think the images speak for themselves. They're always coupled with an after image. This is the orchard. This is an event space that we conceived of that was just mown lawn rolling down to the river. We opened it up. We nestled it in. We created some seating areas, very, you know, small, minimal moves, highly used by the museum now. The emergent wetland, we created an entire larger scale area for all the parking lot runoff to filter down into, a whole new system of plants that offer, you know, pollinator garden, rain garden, all the above, and a boardwalk that takes you through it along the trail. And then finally, connecting people back to the river, which had become overrun with so much Japanese knotweed. And we were able to build a small overlook very sensitively just above the high water line with white oak, granite, black locust. Some of these details, I think you might see, it's very important to our firm. Detailing, obviously, highly crafted details is something that I think we are just viciously excited about all the time. Like, we're defensive of things and materials, but we're also really interested in innovating with things that you'd see, you know, a farmer use and use them in a creative way. I was there yesterday. This has not moved in 6 years. This has not moved, even with all the rise and fall of the tidal change. This is a tidal river. Okay, Charbrook. This is our home. This is where I live with Steve and our children. And this is the mosaic of an aerial that describes the, I would say, a typical New England landscape, central Massachusetts: forest, wetland, woods, open fields, remnant, you know, remnant farm. The 100 acres on the right is the Stimson farm that he grew up on. Actually, our nephews are there, 11th generation now, living there with their families. On the left-hand side is about 40 acres that we own about 20, and then 20 we lease, long-term 25-year lease with our town for haying and for nursery operations. So we've been at this for over a decade now, and I had to talk about the farm when I was at the American Academy, and I kind of said, you know what, when I met Steve, I knew I wanted to homestead with him when we talked about, you know, building a life together. And we built this place. We started at first by ourselves and working here on weekends with the land, often building landscape elements. Here we're, you know, building a threshold to a front door that doesn't even exist yet. But as landscape architects do, we tend to think about landscape before the building. And we started building stone walls, bringing back some of the pastures, clearing, selectively clearing, keeping large stands of trees like white birches, but bringing back the remnants of agriculture, which were these stone walls. And then building, I would say, a new attitude about hedgerows and sort of horticulture. And so we planted a lot of whips and small trees at the time because we had a tree nursery down the road at the old farm. And this was about 5 years in, what it looked like, maybe even 3 years in, that hedgerow you can see along the wall. I'm standing in a sheep pasture looking at this. We always experimented from the beginning. You can see the house isn't even finished. And we planted this entire upper pasture with buckwheat. And that's now our dog's name. But the buckwheat attracted so much wildlife. The turkeys were just out of this world that year when we did this. And we would experiment with mowing different formations within the buckwheat pasture. Again, planted our own trees that we had raised in the nursery, about 35 feet on center. The left-hand side is a row of trees. The right-hand side was where we had that hedgerow. And this is what it looked like about 8 years later. Matt in our office likes to joke that the right side is me. And that's sort of a little bit more wild. I don't mind the line, but I like everything inside the line going crazy. Steve, agrarian, dairy farm, really likes that order. And we love the tension between the two. I would actually say after Rome, I don't feel like it's tension anymore. I feel like it's complementary and it works together. We need both. We need both forms and systems. Lots of working gardens right outside the house. And again, more experimentation with materials, leftover materials from projects, runnel that we built with cousin Dave, who's a welder. And Mike Igo helped us with the circulation, the recirculating feature. Steve actually built this himself. We did all of the plumbing ourselves. And it's a good test, and it really gives you respect for the contractors that you work with when you start building these things yourself. This is maybe a morbid thing, but Steve said, I've always wanted to use one of those burial caskets. They're really thin concrete and they're really inexpensive. I mean, I think we paid $400 for this. And the guy was like, you want to do what with this? But we used it. We used it as a water trough and it's great. It hasn't cracked. We've had it for about 6 years. So again, in the woods, we've got the spring, which we love. We've got this sauna that we built, this box out of pine that we harvested from our land. And then we had these staves made with a sawmill just over the border up in New Hampshire, because we wanted to test out this facade for this other building that I'm actually sitting in, and I'll get to that in a minute. So more testing, lots of testing. Management with animals. Steve always wanted American milking Devon. So this is a herd of cows. And I always wanted sheep. So these are my sheep. I'm saying this in the past tense because we moved to Rome to the American Academy and we said goodbye to the animals briefly. There's a hiatus here. I think at heart, I put a couple of these images in because I think at heart, I would like to be thought of as a naturalist. I really don't think of myself as just a landscape architect or an artist or what. I mean, I really would like to be known when I'm gone as a naturalist. And my connection to the outdoors, and I guess I say rural landscape because that's my bread and butter. That's what my roots are. Collecting chaga, foraging, teaching my kids how to find fiddleheads. I mean, this is really what I live for. I love sharing this with my practice too, in as many ways as possible, not literally, but maybe even figuratively. We've got this nursery, which is a way that we've shared our rural life and our philosophy about horticulture with our firm. And so for many, many years now, we've just been sort of cultivating this nursery. People come out, they plant in the spring, they dig in the fall, they learn how to lace a root ball. I mean, this is talk about, really respecting the landscape contractors and understanding what they go through when they have to move trees. Our team really understands that. So for many years, we used to have all our retreats up at the house, at the farm. We'd have them inside our living room, always opened our home to our colleagues. And then we realized the firm's getting too big. We need to we need to push. We need to push down the hill. So at the bottom of the driveway a few years ago, we built a passive house model studio. We worked with Opal, some architects friends up in Maine. We really loved what they did to help us. So this is, super insulated building, triple glazed windows. We really wanted to be off the grid. We're looking at getting solar put on the equipment shed behind me. We've got working gardens, experimental gardens. This is my favorite garden. I know there's some people listening who are in the studio that don't love this garden, but this is my favorite garden. It's Wildness in a box. And I just feel like the facade of the building really needs this because it's so modern and crisp. So we really, we're just having fun and testing things. And how long can a live oak, can a white oak live edge board be milled before it goes crazy, and the answer for us is about 35 feet. So we're learning a lot about materials and about plants and about, how closely you can plant things before it really becomes a nuisance. I mean, sure, we learn that on our projects too, but there's nothing like being able to draw a planting plan, work on it and say, hey, you know what, put the pencils down, get out of CAD, let's walk outside and, take a look at the stuff. And, oh yeah, at 35 feet, it's really starting to warp. So open studio, kids, families, everyone at some point, everyone in our studio is basically like an aunt or uncle to our children. We've got this Grange hall that I'm sitting in. We have exhibits in here. We have events. We've got all our retreats now in a much larger space, which is wonderful. And at our retreats, we try to get people to, get outside and do things that they don't normally get to do when you're sitting in front of a computer in a 5th floor walk up, in Cambridge, for example, building terrariums, collecting mosses, learning your ground covers, tie-dyeing, craft. I am so dedicated to this concept of having other things tangible that you can make that are fast, that whether it's cooking or tie-dyeing or knitting or sewing, painting, drawing, they're faster than landscape architecture, and you can have a product that's tactile and it can sort of like replenish your sensibility about being a creative person because our projects take so long. I mean, 12 years, Hardberger Park, that's a lifetime. You can go from being a kid to a parent at that age. So the farm, the last thing I'll say, we draw. It's so great. We say, you know what, let's just build it. Let's take an afternoon. We built this idea of a swale in an afternoon together. And then I started really thinking, this was a little test idea for Amherst College Student Center that we're working on. I said, you know what, we need to tell the client. So we pitched this to the client. This is a new project that we're doing with Herzog Demeron right now out in Amherst College. And it's all on structure, these gardens that we're building on structure. So Amherst College agreed to it. They said, okay, build us a test plot at your farm. And we had the land, we have the equipment, we've got the wherewithal to do this kind of thing. It was extremely effective. And we built it. We've got a lot of people in our studio who have second lives, as landscape architects, but previous lives as masonry, contractors, working in a plant nursery, and not afraid to get dirty. This is the hands-on stuff that I love. And we built this thing in 2 days. We laid the pavement, we laid the plants, we had Herzog Demeron here, we had Sasaki, the architect of record, we had the whole Amherst College team here, including the director of facilities, the director of, campus management, and actual, like the guys on the ground are just as important who are going to be caring for this place as, the lead designer from Herzog Demeron. And that's what's so exciting to me is the farm's about bringing people together and talking about design and being able to build things in a way as a mock-up that, I've never been able to do before. And if we didn't have the land, we couldn't do it in the same way. And so that's an opportunity and something I've just become very passionate about and I'm excited about. All right, I'm going to end. I think I'm on really good time right now. I'm at 39 minutes. I'm very proud of myself. I am going to finish with the American Academy in Rome. This was a curveball for me. I have been going so, excitedly strong with my practice that I had never really thought about taking a break. And I started to get a little overwhelmed, I think, with maybe the financial and management and sort of implications overall of running a practice that was no longer 25 people, but had grown to sometimes 45 people in the middle of the summer with a bunch of interns also. And as much as I loved it, I felt a little overwhelmed in needing some space. And the motto at the American Academy in Rome is great. It's time and space to think and work. So I applied for a fellowship last minute and I got one. And we moved in January, end of January 2024 of this year. These are our two children at the American Academy at the Gates. It's a very foreboding place. And at first, because I didn't know anything about it. And then within days, it became our second home. And I basically focused on everything I don't do in my day job here. I abandoned the computer. I did not use a computer for 6 months. I picked up my sketchbook. I carried it with me to a lot of places. This is Pompeii. And I just drew a lot in my sketchbook and thought about things maybe a little bit more loose. I purposely did not pick up a measuring tool. There was an old Mayline in my studio. And I said to my husband, that's your space if you'd like to use it, but I am not going to do a measure drawing here. And I did what I do, what I kind of do at home. I started collecting things and foraging. And I started bringing a lot of plant material into the academy. And the guard at the front, which is sort of, raise an eyebrow. I collected a lot of different botanical specimens in the parks. I collected a lot of cultural specimens also, which I just became fascinated by. And I realized that's my way of getting to know a site, is getting really tactile with the plants and with the remnants before I would inevitably, what I wanted to do was paint. I wanted to paint. I actually am so proud of this. These are all of my son's, 5-year-old son's foraging things that he would bring home from preschool. He went to an Italian preschool, and so did my daughter, went to an Italian Roman Catholic school, but he brought these home every day for me, and they became part of my final exhibit at the Academy. So these are pictures from the studio, some of the foraged specimens. You can see on the left my response to foraging. At first, I got pretty literal with the painting, and I would say, yeah, very literal, trying to be looser. They do a very good job at connecting you with all of the other fellows. And that's one of the most wonderful things, is that there are people from all walks of life in different but related fields, allied fields in the humanities, arts and humanities. And so you present your work and you get to hear other people's work. And then you sit at a table every single day at lunch. You always sit at this table, this common table, and you have lunch and you have discourse. And it is such a joy to do that. And we've, really, I really want to do this in our firm. It is so important to take that break, to eat together and to talk about what you're working on in your studio or what's going on in your life. And, working through problems. I got through so many of my design or, art thinking problems in my head at lunch and at dinner. Everyone's child becomes yours. Everyone shares everything. This is our backyard, our communal backspace, communal living. It was communal living 100%. I highly recommend this idea of fellowship or a break to anybody who's remotely considering it. I was always against it. I never thought this would be something that I would do as an adult, because I never thought I would be able to take the time away from my practice. And it has helped me immensely. Just some images from the studio, from the final exhibit. They open up the entire academy to the city of Rome. So about 1,700 people roll through during open studios. And, I just thought outside of the box. I got to do things that were sort of instant and tactile. And there's more messaging behind all this, but I don't have time to get into it. But I really think that the quickness and the immediacy of some of these drawings has helped me refocus into what's really important in my life right now. And I think full circle, I'm coming back from Rome with these fresh eyes about my practice. This is my last image, and thinking really hard about, what kind of practice do I want to be part of with my team for the next half of my career? Because I've got, still quite a bit in me. I'm sort of halfway through my career, and I'm really interested to see, now that I've stepped away, people held down the fort and people are you know, just evolving. And so I really feel like we've got this collective, and I'm thinking very differently about our practice right now. And I'm in a very positive place. So I think I'll end with that and say I hope that this was helpful and educational for people. I am a landscape architect, but I'm also a lot of other things too. And thank you very much for listening.
That was absolutely wonderful, Lauren. Thank you so much for your talk. It must have been very hard to come back from Rome. It seemed like an idyllic, dreamy trip. Makes me now want to go take 6 months in Rome and decompress. It sounds absolutely lovely. And before we get into any questions, we have probably just a couple minutes to do some. Your point about wanting to be considered a naturalist, I think, really came through. I mean, can you talk maybe a little bit more? I'm really impressed. Actually, the 3 talks that we've had for landscape design this year, the theme of ecology has really resonated a lot. I would say maybe yours is the most. It seems very extremely authentic, but can you talk a little bit more, maybe like I would call you an ecologist before I'd call you a landscape architect. I mean, it really seems like that's infused in you, and just maybe your philosophy, maybe some of your thinking, or just your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I guess I know it's sort of hard to I hate when, people put, someone in a box. And
Mhm.
I mean, I'm a very conceptual thinker, and I have a long ways. I have a cousin who's a landscape ecologist, and I just do not understand most of her journal articles. They're just like way above my head. I would say the one thing I'm not, and that became very apparent at the academy, is an academic. And I'm okay
Mm.
with that. I think at one point in my career, I thought, oh, I could go into teaching. And then I
Mm.
thought, I can mentor in my studio. And so maybe that's enough. And Steve taught me that. My husband really, felt strongly about that. But I would say, yeah, sure. I have this streak in me that tends to defend Mother Earth, right? I feel like a defender of Mother Earth because
Mhm.
landscape architecture is more, so I wouldn't say I'm an ecologist, right? Naturalist, I think, is someone who doesn't necessarily have the academic training, but actually
Sure.
really cares deeply, right, about the natural world and the systems. And I guess that's really where I come into it, is that I don't claim to be an academic or, an expert at this stuff, but I just feel like in my position as a designer of landscape, that there aren't many of us in the world, and architecture will always be part of the problem. And I don't mean that to say a
Sure.
negative thing about architecture, but architecture is about building and
Mhm.
putting pressure on the earth, no matter how good it is. And listen, we build with wonderful architects who are trying so hard, but architecture puts pressure on the planet, no matter what, no matter how great it is and symbiotic it is. Landscape architecture will always be restorative. It will always be part of the
Mhm.
solution. And I think that's what I'm proud of, being part of this regenerative practice and philosophy.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's we have a school of professional horticulture here at the garden. We take roughly 10 to 12 students, and they stay with us for about 2 years learning horticulture, all aspects of horticulture. To me, it's fascinating and also heartwarming to see how many of the students coming into the program want us to teach them more about restoration ecology and practices as a whole. Like it's just uh, and it's not just as a demographics. The people coming into this program aren't like kids just out of high school. These are people who are 30, 35 years old, are career changers and going into horticulture. And it's fascinating how people are
That's great.
embracing this as a whole, as a practice. I love it, to be honest.
Yes, it's the kind of thinking we need. And you don't need to, necessarily have a master's degree in it.
That's right.
You can affect, you can change, you can make change, real change in different ways. There are a lot of people I met at the academy who are, advocates for, I don't know, like they were a board chair on some committee for a museum in, downtown LA. And they had a lot of power. You can wield a lot of power
Sure.
with design projects and wearing many different hats. And yes, Yep.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would even say, given that I've done too much grad school, we probably need less of the grad school people and more of the people boots on the ground doing some of the work is what we probably need with a lot of these projects as well. Related to that, there was a question asking if you've done any projects in which you research the ecology, land use, plant and animal life back to like pre-colonial times, things like that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I always try to trace something back as far as I can. That's just part of it's my own interest, but also because it's important, to have that narrative. I worked at the Haystack Mountain School of Crafts a few years ago. I'm still working with them now, and the we had a First Nations consultant from the Penobscot tribe there, and that was extremely helpful. And I think maybe to say that often you cannot find traces of indigenous pre-colonial anything. Like the
Right.
footprints are gone because the touch was so light or it was seasonal. And, aside from a midden site or, written documentation, it's rarely there. But I would say, like at Haystack, we did a lot of research and a lot of, um, I mean, I became very fascinated with that pre-colonial forest, for example, or the type of ecology that did exist, and the horticulture that existed, the really, really big trees of, that part of Maine that no longer are there, or you might have like one or two,
Right.
old growth trees.
Remnant
Anyway,
tree.
yes, absolutely. I mean, of course, it has to be done. I don't think it's done enough, that kind of level of research. And I can't just focus on the physical landscape attributes. I always have to dig into that which came before. Yep.
Gotcha. And then maybe our last question, given that we're right at 7:30, is what do you have on the drawing board that you haven't told us about? Like what's happening now? Like what are you excited to maybe give us a hint at?
Well, I'm looking over at the walls here. I'm not working on this as much, but I'm sort of a design consultant on it. A big river restoration project for Providence, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, which is exciting because it's just down the road. And it really needs a major vision. So we're working with Air up there, and it's a very large river restoration project. And I'm, coming back from Rome. We had a pause with our project at Amherst College, this new student center, which is quite large. It's a massive, new building with Herzog Demeron, and that is now in construction. So that is probably one of my favorite phases. I love concept phase. I mean, I like all the phases, but I love going into construction phase. Just when the grading starts and we start thinking about the planting, and then like what's going to happen when we get the plants on site, inevitably things get moved around. And I love that part. I love the spontaneity of coming up with something based on what the plants, the availability at the nursery or whatever was grown for the project, like how it came out. I mean, this is a 5-year construction project, 5-year long project. So just in construction. So it's going to be very exciting to get this. It's a massive rewilding. I should have said that. It's the first time there's no lawn on the project. And so this is the first time Amherst College is kind of doing something major, around the student center with a different ethos about what a student center can be in terms of health and wellness. So
How exciting.
yes, it is exciting. It's just in our backyard. Who would have thought?
Well, Lauren Stimson, thank you so much. That's a absolutely wonderful, beautiful, heartwarming talk. We're probably going to have you come back to talk about this rewilding project because we're going to want to know so much more. But thank you once again for sharing all these wonderful slides, these pictures with us in your story. And thanks once again. Everybody have a good night.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.